Hello, everybody. I want to welcome you to the Progverse, exploring the Progverse. This is a live stream that we'll be doing. This is my first one, so I'm not really expecting too much. I've tried to fix the brightness a bit. However, it's just the time of day. Unfortunately, we may have to change times, or I could use the lighting, but the lighting tends to make it too blurry. So we're going to go with this for now. And if I decide that I will try the lighting, I will add that to what we're doing here today. So basically, we're just here to talk about this band, Rush. This will be my first one. So I thought I would pick a topic that I knew something about, which is Rush, my favorite band. I know quite a bit about them, but I wouldn't call myself an expert. I'm certainly not one of those devoted Rush only guys. That's not me. I do love Rush. I've loved Rush since I discovered them back in 1977 and then began to follow them in 1980. Before that, I was kind of just learning about them, right? Because I was basically a Kiss fan at that point in time. So anything that wasn't Kiss wasn't of interest to me. So I'm just going to turn this other light on because I think that we probably could use it. There we go. I think that's a little bit better. Still got a little bit of that blur effect. I'm not really happy with that, but as I do more and more of these, I think this will get better, especially once I get my other computer online. I'm having access issues to it now because it's been locked away for some time. Anyways, so we're here to talk about Rush. So Rush is a band that has been around in its earliest forms since 1968, in which you had Alex Lifeson, basically the founding member, the only founding member left of the band, who put together or was involved with a couple of guys who put together a band, and they chose the name Rush. I'm not going to get into where that name came from because I don't want to go there today. Anyways, basically from 1968 until they made their first album in 74. Basically, he was kind of the leader. They did bring on Geddy Lee when they replaced the vocalist bass player, and Alex asked Geddy to come in and take over the position. At some point, they also let Geddy go, but then brought him back. So there's a little bit of a story behind that, but I'm not going to get it too much into the personal stuff. I've been reading Geddy's book. Actually, I've had it for a while. I started reading it, and then I had a bunch of other stuff that needed to be read first, which I've been doing, and I will get back to it, no doubt about it. So anyways, we're going to start kind of just discussing their discography, and as things come up and ideas come up, then we'll discuss that. If anybody has any questions, they can ask them on the chat line as well. So the first album was this one. Not really an impressive cover, but for that time period, not too bad either. I think we could do much better now, but back then finances were limited and creativity was a bit limited to what they could afford to do. And so they did this, and it's not necessarily a bad cover. It's an attempt to show them as an explosive band that's going to come out here and wow you, which they did on this album, I think. This album's very kind of early, kind of what you would call hard rock, metal. I wouldn't say it's too metalish. It's got a little bit of that element. It's very heavy. They do have a little bit of that element of metal in it, but I wouldn't call this a metal album by any stretch. It was a hard rock album, and it basically had the one kind of big hit at the time that got a lot of radio play, which was In the Mood. But over time, Working Man has become the kind of thought of as the quintessential song on this album. And really kind of highlights the band's sound, and it also highlights Alex Lifeson's guitar ability. This is kind of where it starts with them. And they, like many other bands of that time period, were a guitar-driven band. They had a solid drummer and a great bass player, but the guitar was the dominant instrument, as it was for many bands in that time. It was the instrument of highlight because that's what made rock big, was the guitar, right? And so You've got a lot of other songs on this that have kind of stood the test of time. I like Finding My Way. I've always thought this was one of their deep cuts that I feel is a much better song and one of their stronger songs in the early days of Rush. And I still like this song quite a bit. It's if when I'm listening to the album, I always listen to that track because it comes up first, but I always never cut out before that. Um, Need Some Love and Take a Friend and Here Again are all good, solid tracks, but you know, they're more for serious Rush fans, I think. They're not songs that readily come to mind if you're just a casual person, right? And then what you're doing is kind of the Led Zeppelin-ish kind of tune on here. Many people have likened Rush at this time period to being like Led Zeppelin, but really the only song that really reminds me of Led Zeppelin is What You're Doing. It sounds a little bit like Heartbreaker. It's got a little bit of that going on. Uh, but it's a classic heavy song. And then of course, you've got Before and After, which is another one of those kind of maybe unknown songs that you might not get if you're listening to Rush as a casual fan. So this album again released in 1974, so their debut album. By this time, they were starting to tour with other bands, Kiss being, of course, the notable one that everybody knows about, and they know about the tour and stuff like that. Most Rush fans will know about that. Very different bands, but maybe at this period of time, their music was a lot more in line with what Kiss was doing. Kiss, a hard rock glam band. These guys, more of a hard rock band. They didn't really have the stage show that Kiss had, so they weren't really a big threat to them. Yes, instrumentally, they're a much better band, even at this stage, than Kiss was, but not a huge threat. And so, as a consequence, they toured. I think they toured with this album and maybe right into Fly By Night before they kind of broke ways with each other. Rush started in a different direction by that time. Yeah, so I think of this as a good, solid album. I've actually liked this a lot more when I was younger. I'm just going to fix it because it seems to have slid here. Yeah, so it's when I when I was younger, I kind of liked this album a little more. It was a little bit more receptive to me because I was already predisposed to it because of Kiss's music and some of the other hard rock bands like BTO and that. And so I thought it was well within that range. It wasn't until later that I began to discover, and probably the reason why I didn't get into Rush really till 1980, I wasn't mentally in the realm that I needed to be to get to that stage. So the next album out is probably my second favorite Rush album. It was the first album I ever discovered, Fly By Night. The album covers immensely better than the initial one. They had some real kind of, and this is one of their actually better album covers, I think. A little bit more sophisticated, much more up tempo, much greater artwork involved here, I think. Only 8 tracks, and the first one had 8 tracks as well, so it seemed to be a theme for them at this point. Very different sound to this album. You have a new drummer, John Rutsey's out the door, and in comes Neil Peart. And that's the beginning of Rush. Like there's basically been the three of them since then until until they retired back in 2015. So you've got on this album another album produced by Terry Brown. I believe he was on the first one. No, it was produced by Rush on the first one. So this is the beginning for Terry Brown. You bring in Terry Brown, he makes a huge difference in the quality of the music. You bring in Neil Peart, much better drummer. Nothing against John Rutsey, who I think was a good drummer. And because Neil Peart also could write lyrics, it then highlighted and began to expand Rush's need to put out stories and talk about stuff that maybe they couldn't have done without Neil Peart's incision into the band. So you've got 8 tracks on here. I would say, in the end, Fly By Night, Best I Can. These are all tracks that could have easily fit into the first album as well. They're not totally dissimilar in the end. And Fly By Night, even Making Memories, they all could have been in there. Making Memories a little bit softer than what you might have got on the first album, but definitely would have fit in there. Fly By Night, of course, the lyrics are a little bit better here. And Making Memories the same way, but Best I Can and In the End were songs that were written, I think, prior to this album and probably would have fit into that narrative very well. But then you've got other songs on this album like Rivendell. This is not something they could have put on the first album. It's a very different song. It's also much softer. You've got, of course, Anthem, which is a much heavier, and this is a song that kind of started to dictate the direction in which they would go. A lot more complex musically. The lyrics are much better. And then you get to Bytor and the Snow Dog, which is kind of the first kind of epic length song or mid-epic length song, depends on what you consider epic. Some people think of epic as being those 15, 16-minute plus songs, and the ones in the middle are kind of transitionary songs that, have more than a 4 or 5 minute song, but aren't as epic in scale as you would get in a later 15, 16-minute long epic alongside. But Bytor and the Snow Dog, an excellent song, and I think it's kind of the beginning of that progressive movement right here with this song. Yes, Anthem, Rivendell, a little bit of that, but Bytor and the Snow Dog is kind of the chief activator of that on this album. And so you're getting a very different sound with this, much more complex, much better instrumentation, much more sophisticated lyrics on topics that are quite a bit more involved than the original rock and roll themes of love and sex and drugs. You get a lot more of that going on here. The song is at a much higher beat and a much heavier song than anything I think on the first album, with the exception of maybe Working Man. So yeah, an excellent album. I do love the cover of this album a lot. It's probably my favorite Rush cover because I'm an Owl fan, really. And really, the band is still on that train of discovery here. So they've begun to change. They know they don't want to do what they did on the first album. They want to move in a different direction, but they're still exploring what that direction might be. But there's enough heaviness on here that it ties that first album with them, and enough experimental stuff that it connects it with the future. So to me, this is an excellent album. It did have Fly By Night was the radio song that got played quite a bit. Probably a better song than In the Mood overall, and it's one of my favorite Rush songs as well. That and Making Memories are the two songs I liked initially, and then I grew into more of the progressive sounds of Bytor and the Snow Dog and Anthem. Best I Can, another really good track, would have been the easiest of these tracks to fit on that first album. I think it was actually written during that time. I've actually seen a live concert of them at a high school in which they played this song, and this is prior to Neil Peart. So there you have it. With Terry Brown on the picture, it makes it a much stronger album. I think the album did better too, as well. So we're going to move on to the third album, Rush's Caress of Steel, a much more dark and sinister appearance to this album. I used to think of this as being more of a mellow album, but in retrospect, I would say this is a lot heavier in some ways as well. So now you're getting into a much more progressive element. Yes, you still have Bastille Day, and I think I'm Going Bald, Lakeside Park. Those three songs, of course, could easily fit into that earlier Rush, although the lyrics on Lakeside Park and Bastille Day are a lot more complex, so they could have easily gone on to Fly By Night then, those songs. Then you got, I think I'm Going Bald is kind of a song, it's a one-off song which they attempted to kind of poke fun of Kiss's Going Blind. I think that was part of it. And this album, they became much more experimental with doing different things, different time signatures, trying to create a much more progressive feel to their music. The Necromancer, which is the fourth track on this side of the album, was one of the earlier songs that I identified with, was because they are talking about a place that I'm familiar with, which is Willowdale and Toronto area and the Don River and all those places. It's a heavier album with lots of kind of foreboding in it. It's a more of a science fiction feel to it, with its heavier parts, but also it's kind of overshadowing by the voices done by Alex Lifeson, talking about what's going on in the storyline. Yeah, so a kind of a mini epic. And then you get the flip side, which is a epic song, one of my favorites by them, The Fountain of Lameth. I should probably get a water, otherwise this is going to go on badly, but we'll finish this first and then we'll go on. I'll get a water and we'll go on to the next album. So this album was their attempt to try to move into that progressive realm. I actually love this album. It's one of my favorite Rush albums, in my top 5 for sure, but it didn't do very well commercially, and they took a lot of heat for it. They even came up with the term, this was the end of the road tour. This album has its hard parts on this song, but it's basically a story about searching for that fountain of youth, I guess. And it talks about all the different stages in life, and you feel like the person's getting older and older, and then they get to the end, which is the fountain, which is the 6th part of this suite, 6 suite set. A much more kind of not as clean sounding album, I don't think. It has its good parts. The songs are excellent. They're a little bit more stark, a little bit more cut, a little less clear, maybe a little bit more murky. But a fantastic album. Again, Terry Brown doing the thing here. I do like the artwork here. It's more of a classical look, both sides of the album. You get that classical feel of the album. But I think that the music itself wasn't really kind of grasped by people. They didn't know what this was. It's completely different than what you would have got with Fly By Night. Yeah, it did carry over some of the progressive elements, a lot more of the progressive elements. They almost like jump ship from the other stuff to this. But again, a very experimental album, but nevertheless a fantastic album. So Caress of Steel is their 3rd studio album. I'm going to be back in 1 minute. And here we are. We're back. I do apologize. I got everything ready but my drink because I knew I was going to get a dry throat and then I just forgot to get it. Anyways, we're talking about the Rush albums. And anything else that you want to talk about that's Rush? Okay, so from the 3rd album, they come to their 4th album, Rush's 2112. Now, a great cover, of course. I think the beginning of that kind of Rush is kind of a space feel to it. There's a lot of similarities between these 2 albums, and I've talked about this in a video called What's the Difference not too long ago. A lot of, this has a epic side-long overture with 7 parts that had a 6th. This one has 5 kind of more traditional sounding songs. That had 3, but there's a lot of similarity here. The only real difference, to my way of thinking, is that Caress of Steel has the Necromancer, which there's nothing really that equals that on this album. There's nothing similar to it here. So anyways, this starts out, so they've kind of polished it up a bit. So they realized that they were on the track that they wanted to be on, but they were taking heat for that track. So they knew now that they had to come out with something much more commercially acceptable. That was the biggest issue with Caress of Steel. It didn't satisfy that. So they came up with 2112, which was laced with hooks and catchy riffs and fantastic kind of lyrics and some incredible drumming. And Geddy Lee's absolutely kind of vibrating vocal, high-pitched vocal voice, which really I think takes real full effect here on the song 2112. So this was a much more successful commercial album. To me, that's the biggest difference between the two. They had a lot of other stuff that was very similar. This was much more commercially acceptable. It was cleaner. Production was much better. There wasn't as stagnant or cut parts as there was on Necroman, on the Caress of Steel. And the album, of course, was more open. Like this is in like people are, what is this? You know, it's very science fiction oriented, which was a big thing in this early mid 70s. So then you've got, of course, 2112 and its 7-part soliloquy, or 7-part suite, as you might want to call it, starting out with the 2 big parts, Overture and the Temples of Shrinks. This is the beginning of that real catchy part. They used this particular track on what would have been called the New Music Show early in the 80s. And it was the opening to the channel, and just really catchy as hell. And people just loved it. This took them in a different direction too. So at this point, they're kind of a mismatch. They have some hard rock, some soft rock, some progressive rock, and just a mix of different things here. But this really takes them in that kind of metal direction. And the progressive element is still growing here. So you have a growing progressive element, a heavy metal kind of element coming on board. And then you have a bunch of songs that are kind of like their traditional stuff. So keeping their older fans, but still moving in a different direction. You have songs like Passage to Bangkok and Something for Nothing, which are 2 tracks that got some airplay and people kind of like them because they're catchy. They're not too hard to absorb, but they talk about things that are commonplace at the time. And then you've got the 3 songs in the middle, Twilight Zone, Lessons in Tears, which are all good songs, but maybe appealing to maybe certain people, but not everybody in the Rush catalog. And then you have people who outside of Rush wouldn't even know these songs. But an excellent album, and the beginning in many ways of them as a band. They were now on the front page, no longer supporting, but now frontlining stuff. And this was the one that also the executives who were producing, or not producing their album, but funding their albums, the record label, now said, okay, these guys get it. We can leave them alone, let them do what they want. And that's not something that happened much early in rock, especially at this time period. Most bands were having problems with their management. Rush seemed to have none of that. And Terry Brown, of course, is still producing this album as well. I think this is an excellent album, but I for one prefer Caress of Steel just because of the content. Even though it's not as good musically maybe as 2112, I think the content of the album and the bits and pieces of the album are better. And I felt like I was more connected to the album because of the subject matter I relate it more to. So, but overall, this is a great one. I think beginning of their ranks. So we're going to move on to the next album, which really is the beginning of that progressive movement in full force here. But before we get to that, we're going to talk a little bit about the first live album they put out, which is this one. This encapsulates the first 4 albums by Rush. You've got Bastille Day, Anthem, Fly By Night, and In the Mood, a combo, and then Something for Nothing, Lakeside Park, 2112, and it's four parts of the suite, 5 parts, sorry, and then By Tour and the Snow Dog, of course, that first kind of mini epic that they did on Fly By Night. In the End, Working Man, Finding My Way Together, and then What You're Doing. So they've got kind of an overview of their entire 4-disc, their initial run into the rock world. And of course, on top of that, you also have Neil Peart's Epic's drum solo, which put him on the map at this point. Many people liked his drumming. I'm sure he was thought of as a good drummer, but this just kind of put him in a different echelon on this album, and people became aware of his abilities much more. And this is a well put together live album. I don't think it's as the sound on it isn't as good as maybe some of their next stuff that would come out was, but it wasn't bad. And they didn't have as much of a stage show then because they were still just building. But overall, they chose good songs to put on here, and I think this was really catchy and really well liked. I remember liking this album a lot when it came out. So that puts to me, that's the end of their first stage of their career. And then this album is the beginning of a totally different set of animals here. So, they've done their 2112, they've done their Caress of Steel. They're taking what they learned from that, adding a totally different element here. So a lot more different instruments being played on this album, a much more spacey kind of mystical feel to this album that you don't get with the previous albums. And it's almost like a totally different band again. So they're, again, reinventing themselves and taking some of the stuff they've learned in the past and reapply it. Gone now is all of that feeling you had on the first couple of albums, that kind of rock-based, maybe Humble Pie sound, Led Zeppelin sound, that's gone here. This is a totally different animal. And it starts out with arguably the best 1-2 punch of any Rush album, which is Farewell to Kings and Xanadu. These are fully prog related, very mystical sounding songs, and Xanadu in particular is the song that I've probably listened to the most of any rock song in history. And this just really ignites Rush into a different stratosphere, with now being thought more along in the lines of Yes and Genesis, now fitting into that category much more smoothly than they did on their predecessors. Then you've got the backside of the album, which also features one of their bigger hits, Closer to the Heart. At this time, it's the 2112 Fly By Night, In the Mood type of things that have been going on. This is a very rock radio friendly, almost an anthem-like song, and just very Anthem in the sense of people wanting to hear it type of thing, not Anthem in the anthem from Fly By Night. And then you got Cinderella Man, Mad Rigel, Cygnus X1, which are all, well, Cinderella Man is more of a radio friendly song as well, where the other two, Mad Rigel, kind of a bit different. Interesting that Yes did a Mad Rigel on the very next album that they did. Kind of a funny thing that happened there. Cygnus X1, which is the beginning of the Cygnus 2-part, which you get the finish of on the next album, is a very different song. Very progressive, of course, but much more. They're expounding on a lot of science fiction here and really making a mystical feel. So this whole album has that kind of almost a mystical feel to it. And I think personally think this was a better album than 2112, although 2112 is often loved by the metal people. This one, not so much. This one's much more of a progressive album, but still, and the cover I love. This is now they're getting a little bit more you might want to say progressive in their album covers as well. This one is much more experimental than a lot of their previous stuff. You've got a lot of instruments on here that you don't see on the other ones as much. A lot more classical guitar parts here. You've got a lot of keyboard and synthesizers, although you were getting that on 2112. This is much more dominated by that. And their mystical or science fiction realm of lyrics are really prominent on this as well. So this is an excellent album. It's also one of my 5 favorite Rush albums and one of my masterpieces. So the next album out takes that even farther with Hemispheres. This really kind of is them taking the progressive stuff to the extreme. And they suffered a little bit of a letdown here commercially, because it's kind of the same thing that happened with Fly By Night, which was going very well in the direction they were going, and then all of a sudden they go into Caress of Steel and people don't know what's going on, so that album didn't do as well either. Then they come back online with 2112 and Farewell to Kings, and they get to this album, they're taking it too far again in the commercial sense of the word. And so people aren't quite sure how to take this as well. And to be honest, I didn't like this album when I first heard it. I thought it was way beyond anything I'd heard before and wasn't sure if I wanted to accept it or not. I'm just going to push that back in because it's sticking out. There, that's better. But, you've got basically 4 tracks on here. You've got another epic long side, which you've now had twice in there with the Fountain of Lameth and the 2112 6-part. This one is only another 6-part one, Hemispheres. This is the second part of Cygnus X1, the book 2, if you prefer. Lots of stuff going on here. Much clearer sound on this album than was on that 2112 album. This is very clear, very well produced. And the instrumentation is probably off the charts. They pushed themselves to the very nth degree on this album, as good as you could expect from 3 musicians. They really pushed themselves as far as they could go, almost to the point where they were exhausted. You've got the 3 tracks on the backside, Circumstance, which is, I think, kind of an attempt to be a commercial track, a little bit more commercial. Its length and its substance and its catchy hooks and rhythms lend itself to that. I don't know that it ever really took off, though. Then you have Trees and La Villa Strangiato, which are the 2 back tracks, and often are played in Rush in concert when they play these 2 songs. La Villa Strangiato has become kind of the great love affair for progressive rock by so many fans now, because it's so detailed and so much instrumentation, so much going on here, and all 3 of the musicians are playing at their absolute extreme abilities, which really adds in. There's no vocals in it, but yet it's probably the only instrumental that I absolutely love, and there's not a word sung in it. So yeah, absolutely an incredible album in that regard, but wasn't well received initially, but has gotten better over years. I think people like this quite a bit more now. It seems to become very appreciated, and many think, and as I do, this has become my second favorite Rush album, which is something I would not have said for even 5 years ago. So on to the next Rush album. This was my entry point. So up until this point, I'd heard stuff from Farewell to Kings. I'd heard 2112, obviously, and I had signed out Fly By Night from the library and had it for a few weeks and listened to it. So I was familiar with their sound. So I was actually prepared a little bit for them to be different than a lot of bands. And a lot of that difference is Geddy Lee's voice, which is very high pitched and different than you would never mix his voice up with anybody else. It's just different than anybody else's. And so they came in with this album, which I think is a wonderful cover. Obviously, destruction has happened here, nuclear destruction, more than likely. This is another Terry Brown album, another produced by him. And this was my entry point. And this album is now, they've taken what they've learned on Hemispheres and Fly By Night on Farewell to Kings, and they've toned down the progressive element a bit and upped the metal element so that they're fairly equal. But then you have a third part, which is that technological, symphonic, whatever you want to call it, sound kind of really takes a little bit of a jump here. And you've got some very polished stuff, I think, and some very progressive elements. So all three of the elements are coalescing here. And this was the beginning of that instrumental technical stuff that they became known for later. Really dominant album, I think. For me, I loved it instantly. It became my favorite album of that year, and there were some really good albums that year. And became my favorite Rush album, and remains there despite the fact that most of the tracks are pretty much burnt to a crisp here, with only Natural Science holding on, probably because it's longer than the other songs. Spirit of Radio, another big hit for them. Not a monster hit. The Rush never had that sort of monster hit at this point. Free Will, another really good instrumental track. I think this really highlights a lot of Geddy Lee's bass abilities as well. Jacob's Ladder is a little bit of a different song. I didn't initially like it. It's grown on me over the year. It's not a song you would hear on rock radio nowadays because it's just too deep of a cut, but it's absolutely a great track. Entre Nous, which was a track that I initially liked along with Spirit of Radio, that I was back and forth between which one I liked more. And then this one just faded and has never really actually returned. After a few weeks, it just never came back. Still, it's a good track. It's just not one that I ever think of much. Different Strings, Alex is again showing his acoustic ability. They were still promoting a little bit of that acoustic ability at this point in time as well. And then Natural Science, of course, which is the epic song on the album, a mini epic, I guess you might call. And they've done that now with 3 or 4 albums in a row where they've had a couple of songs that are in the 8, 9, 10, 11, 12-minute range, starting with By Torn the Snow Dog, The Necromancer. Didn't really have it on the 2112 album, and then went to Xanadu and Cygnus X1 on Farewell to Kings, and then, of course, La Villa Strangiato on Hemispheres, and then this one, which is much more polished, much more symphonic in its nature than the other tracks. And this is the movement that they're starting to move towards. And you're now entering the 1980s, so they've now had quite a few albums now where they're experimenting, and you can see that their sound is really beginning to coalesce here. And for that reason, this is probably one of my favorite albums. The next album up, many feel, is their masterpiece, Moving Pictures, an album that came out in 1981. So now you've got all of that stuff they've been working on over the last half dozen albums now coalescing into a perfect mix here. You've got your perfect progressive sound. You have your perfect heavy sound. You have your perfect technological sound, all coalescing here. Geddy's voice is toned down slightly here. It's not nearly as high pitched as it was previously. And they've got a much more viable commercial selling album, but still retaining a lot of their progressive elements and really bringing the whole bucket together and making a fantastic album. The side one of this is, many feel, is their best side of any of their albums, featuring Tom Sawyer, Red Barchetta, YYZ, and Limelight. Coincidentally, the only one of these tracks that I ever listen to anymore is YYZ. The other 3 I've kind of burned out, especially Tom Sawyer. It's a song I never want to hear again. Anyways, the backside of the album didn't get as much interplay, although Vital Signs was part of that original movement as well. Very different sounds. You've got you're getting a little bit more of that reggae stuff that started with Spirit of Radio and continues here on Vital Signs, a little bit more of it as they begin to move into a different direction. But at this point in time, all the elements that were on Permanent Waves plus some new elements have been added the toning down of Geddy's voice, the commercial sounding of the album. It's well produced. It's everything you could hope for in a rock album, and so it exploded and did very well for them. But not necessarily it's not one of my 5 favorites, but I do appreciate what it achieved. So that's it for that one. So that's kind of, in many ways, that's kind of the top of the hill. And then from here on, it's a little bit of a downhill trend. And some of it drastic at first before they kind of changed back, I believe. So before we get to that, we're going to talk about this live album, which again, like All the World's a Stage, which encapsulated the first 4 albums. This one encapsulates the next 4 albums, starting at Farewell to Kings, Hemispheres, Permanent Waves, and Moving Pictures. As each go along, the production sounds get better, the overall feel of the album gets stronger, the instrumentation is much more sophisticated. The live performance, I think the live performance on this is better than it was on All the World's Stage. You've got your drum parts in here as well, and you've got mostly the songs from the last 4 albums, although they do have a few from the original 4 albums. The Passage to Bangkok is on here. I think that might be the only Beneath, Between, Behind. They decided to add that in there, not having done it on their previous album. So a lot of good stuff going on here. I think this is a strong live album. It's probably my favorite Rush live album. Well, at least classically it was. Maybe some of the newer stuff, the Rockin' in Rio and that are, I think, better stuff. But overall, a strong album. And I think you can see that they've kind of added elements at the back here of each of the previous albums too, to try and tie it all together. And Geddy's voice is great on this. Yeah, it's just everything you would want in a Rush live album. You know, it ends off with La Villa Strangiato, which is an absolutely perfect ending to this album. And it's great. Just a great album, I think. Next up, I'm just going to move these. These are just about done. We have one left in the classic era of Rush, which is this one, Signals. It's actually aptly named. Album cover's not so great, but I get the idea. They're trying to, he's looking for signals from other dogs, obviously. You start getting a little bit more, the technical side has now begun to become the dominant side. The mystical kind of science fiction type lyrics have now started to be replaced with more, how do you want to call it, more topics of the day, more reality-based topics, I guess, maybe you might want to call that. And the songs have become shorter here. There's no epic songs here at all, nothing over 6 minutes, or actually there's a couple that are over 6 minutes, but just slightly over. Again, you have the 3 of them putting together, and the hard element is starting to dissipate. You're not getting as much of that. You're not getting as much as the progressive elements. You're not getting as much of as you did before of that hard rock and stuff. It's a lot more polished. It's toned down a lot. It's a lot more synthesizer parts to it. The keyboards are beginning to become dominant here, and the songs are much shorter. You've got Subdivisions and The New World Man, which were the 2 radio songs that did well. You get a little bit more of that reggae element coming in Digital Man and New World Man, as they try to move much more to that Police sound here on this album. And originally I thought this was a good album, but I think it was based on what they'd done in their past, and I was still seeing bits of that here. I was still hearing bits of it, but I knew that it would change. The elements had changed. It became a much more commercial sounding, much more progressive, not progressive, a lot more toned down, more almost poppy in many regards. So, but there are still some good tracks here. Obviously, Subdivisions is actually kind of a funny song, because although it was a big hit, it's become a song that I like a lot more than I did back then. Analog Kid, Chemistry, The Weapon, which is a second part to The Witch Hunt, and New World Man. These were all tracks that I liked a little bit back then, but I don't listen to them much. Losing It finally got its time. They played it once on concert. and Countdown, which is just a toned down version of the one on this album, which is Camera Eye. So Camera Eye and Countdown to me are pretty similar songs. This is just a less, not a epic. So Countdown was kind of the last kind of epic length song, where these are not like that at all. But still a solid album. So now you're in 1982, things have changed. So that to me is where the classic era of Rush ended, and this era, the new era. At the time, I was wholly disappointed in the next album. I wholly just backed right out of the Rush theme altogether and didn't want anything to do with them. I never owned this album until recent years, but it's grown on me. I see this in actual fact when you look at the 8 tracks on here. None of them there's nothing 6 minutes here. They're all much shorter versions. This album came out 2 years after the Signals album. So by then, my interest in Rush had completely waned. I didn't buy this album. I did hear, I think it was Body Electric. I think that was the track that I heard from them on the radio. And I said, yeah, I knew they were going there. So this is a much more symphonic, electric, keyboard-driven, synthesizer-driven album, and a much darker album too, I think. But lots of really good songs on here. And now I listen to it and I think, wow, there's a lot of stuff on here other than Body Electric. That Red Sector A, I think, is great. Distant Early Warning is great. And Between the Wheels, I like that song a lot too. So, but this is also the beginning of a new producer. So they've got Peter Henderson here on this album. And that's part of the reason why I didn't follow it, because they had changed their producer and their sound. It was too much for me and I just bailed on them completely. But in time, I came to realize this is a better album than Signals was. Album covers better. You're getting into much more computerized, robotic kind of stuff going on here and the storylines of the future, right? Next up is this album, Power Windows. I've never warmed to this album. I only bought it to complete my collection. I've played it once, because I play everything once, at least. I've only listened to it its entirety once. I'm just trying to see. It's still in perfect shape, I don't. The album cover I didn't have a problem with, but overall I just have no interest in most of the tracks on here. I couldn't even tell you anything really much about this. Peter Collins producing this album, so another different producer. I didn't enjoy this at all. I found it very synthetic, very electronic sounding, synthesizer driven. No, hardly any. To me, it wasn't. The guitar and the drums weren't that great. I didn't really pay attention to them, so I can't really say too much about the album other than really was the beginning of at this point, I was not interested in hearing from Rush ever again. And that went on for a good, well, I left listening to them in 83. I still listen to the old stuff. I just wouldn't listen to anything new. And I don't think I changed from that until my daughter was born almost 2 decades later. Next up is this album. Ironically, this is the one album in that time period that I actually don't mind. This is the one with Force 10, which I do mind, and Time Stands Still. Both those tracks I like. But most of the rest of the stuff is okay. Another Peter Collins produced album. Good sounding, but again, very electronic dominated, synthetic, synthesizer driven albums that just had no interest in me. Very poppy as well. But I liked it better than Power Windows. Then you get to this album, which is kind of the beginning of me getting into these, because I didn't listen to this album at all until recent, when I got it about 3 years ago, and had no intention of getting the other ones. But this one changed my mind. I did like some of the tracks on this Roll the Bones, which I thought was kind of very different. Big Wheel. So not anything, and this is Rupert Hine being the producer here, not really much different than Power Windows or Red Sector. What is the name of the album? Red Line? The Red Line? Oh, Hold Your Fire, really? I don't know why I never remember it. I think the reason I never remember it's because I never really wanted to own those albums. I never thought I would and didn't think that I thought Rush was done for me. But when I came back, I did like this album. It was on my playlist. It's one of the only ones of those ones that was on my playlist, and I did like it. I like the album cover. I like the storyline. Some of the tracks are quite good, so I started collecting the other ones too to kind of get myself back in line. Then this one came out, which has an excellent album cover. Lots of songs on here. I can't tell you anything about any of these songs because I've listened to this album a couple times. I do not like it. It's probably my least favorite Rush album. Absolutely don't like anything about it. This is also Rupert Hine. Don't care for this album at all, but I thought it would be better because the album cover is good and it was from the same group that did the predecessor album. So I thought, okay, but again, I didn't really get into it. And this was the album that kind of brought me back to Rush, but not in a big way. I did have it. I did buy it. I did like it, but I never really followed anything else by them. And that's this one. Yeah, excellent album. Counterparts. Every track on here is good. Alien Shore, I like. Nobody's Hero. All basically talking about modern day issues and stuff like that. Nothing super long here, but some real catchy riffs. This is a much heavier album than their predecessors too. They began to change back. Peter Collins again doing the production here after being off for a few albums. Coal Fire, leave that thing alone. Yeah, almost all the tracks on here are really good. A Cut to the Chase, maybe the best song on here, maybe the best song of all of those recent albums up until this one. Yeah, excellent album. I've come to appreciate this much more than I had originally. Okay, then they really moved ahead. But this album I didn't get to until after my daughter was born, but I did go back and get it. Test for Echo. I like the first 4 tracks on here quite a bit. Test for Echo, Driven, Half the World, The Color of Right. All these are great tracks. The bottom half of the album, not so good, but still not bad. The album cover itself is good, despite the crack in my CD, which will be replaced this week when I do the rest of them. Yeah, so a strong album, heavier album than its predecessor, and getting stronger all the time. Unfortunately, Neil Peart's daughter dies. His wife then dies. It looks like Rush is finished. I missed that whole era because I didn't come back until after my daughter was born in 2001, which is coincidentally when this album came out, or actually around the same time. I didn't own this album. This was my last Rush album I owned. It's a good album. It's very dark. Kind of reminds me of Grace Under Pressure, and that is dark. But there's a lot of really good stuff on this album, really catchy riffs, really catchy stuff, but nothing that really holds up as a great Rush album. This was the one that brought me back to the band, really, 2006. Well, I had been listening to them for quite a bit at this point, about 5 years of listening to my older stuff. But this was the first new album I had bought from them since Signals. And I loved this right off the bat. It was my favorite album of that year. I listened to it all the time, so much so that it was in my playlist for about 40 weeks or so, which is a fairly lengthy time. And all the tracks on here are great. Far Cry, of course, is the big one that everybody knows if they follow Rush at all. Armor and Sword was good. Working with Angels was good. The Larger Bowl, I think, was meant to be kind of the single of the album. Also very well. The Main Monkey Business, really good. And you got Malignant Narcissism, which is a great instrumental here. I think this is one of their better ones in recent years. So this album is a strong album. I do like the cover. And the overall feel of this album is much more like a Rush album to me than they've had in many years. Maybe my favorite of the post-classical era albums. Then we get to the final Rush album coming out about 6 years later. I so anticipated. This was the first Rush album in more than 3 decades that I anticipated greatness from, and I hate to say it, I was largely disappointed at first. It didn't even measure up to my daughter's Breakout album by Miley Cyrus. I was playing that more than this, which is a tribute to that album, but not really. So this album sat on my shelf for a good 4 or 5 years. And I had played it here and there, but I just couldn't get into it, other than the song Caravan, which I liked. And that was the thing that kind of hyped me. But the rest of the album I didn't care for at all. And then when I started this channel about 3 years ago, this album kind of really took off for me and became now probably my second favorite post-classic era Rush album. And I do like it a lot now, but it took a long time for this to come around, a very long time. The Wreckers, The Anarchist, Clockwork Angels itself, Caravan, City of Gold, these are all great tracks. And even the final track of Rush's career, The Garden, excellent track. So yeah, so that's it for the discography of Rush, which is, 19 albums plus a couple of live ones there. Really, to me, it's a big deal how many albums they put out. We have a length of stuff. I always kind of wished, I didn't think that Clockwork Angels would be the final album. I thought they would do at least one more. It never took place, and then Neil got sick and died. Do I want anything from Rush now going forward? No. I would just assume they leave this as it is, as beautiful as it is, and maintain that decision to end the group that they decided back in 2015. Would I like to see Geddy and Alex do something else? Yes, of course I would. But will it be Rush? No, it won't. Rush is gone, but they had a great legacy and a great deal of great music, for which I absolutely adored and loved and still do. They're still my favorite band. I don't see that ending anytime soon. But you never know now. I'm open to a lot of things I didn't think possible. But absolutely a great career. You've got 3 what I would call absolutely magnificent musicians, all masters on their own instrument, bass, guitar, drums. In Geddy Lee's case, he also does vocals. His vocals have kind of faded quite a bit over the years, but I still think he has the bass ability is still there, and all their instrumentality is really good. I think Alex has improved and continues to improve. He amazes me. His ability to adjust himself to different sounds too. When they did that Rush album of covers, which I didn't cover here, maybe I should have. I'm not sure where. Oh, you know where it is? It's in the way. It's waiting for its turn in my playlist. Let's see if I can see it here. I don't see it, but it's definitely in there. I should have probably talked about that. On that, he shows his ability to take on music from other bands and just really nail them, right? Some of the Who stuff they did was fantastic, I thought. Just a great guitar player. Doesn't get maybe the kudos that he should get because he's in a band with a legendary drummer and a legendary bass player. And even though, to me, he's as good as either of them, he just doesn't seem to get the kind of critical reception that they do. And I think it's a lot because there are so many good guitar players, more than any other instrument. It's dominated by absolutely fantastic guitar players, but he's one of them for sure. He is. Well, anyways, yeah, a legendary band for a reason, right? Lots of great stuff they've produced. They're such consummate professionals, but yet at the same time, they have fun. They're like a family. You don't see this with very many bands, if any bands really, who are like 3 brothers, just the way in which they do everything together and the way in which they present themselves and how they're just so close to each other. And even though Neil is now gone, he's still very much in their thoughts and in the way they do things, and as they should be. I'm proud to be a Rush fan. I can't imagine not being a Rush fan. It just seems like an impossibility to me. Again, yeah, I just love them. I'm looking forward to now getting back to the book. I have almost done these 3 books that I'm currently reading, and this is going to be one of the 3 that I put in for my reading, and I want to finish it. I did read about 5 or 6 of the chapters, so it's very intriguing. I like Geddy Lee's take on things. He's honest to almost a fault, but he's typical Canadian, too polite, right? For the most part. So anyways, I hope that you've enjoyed this stream. This is the first one I've done. I will do more, and hopefully they'll get better as I plan them a little bit more. Maybe I'll start taking some guests on too. I haven't decided yet. I tend to be a bit of a loner in a lot of things, so and my love of music though brings people together. So I think that eventually there will be people on the channel. So I hope that you've enjoyed this stream. Please, if you come on and check it out later, leave any comments you want in the comment section. And don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons as well as the notification. I'm going to pre-plan the next one. I'm not sure when the next one's going to be. I haven't decided if this is going to be something weekly or maybe once a month show. We'll see how it goes. I actually want to get my other computer sorted out and fixed so that it's running perfectly, and use that one because I think the optics and the audio part are much better on it. So I'm looking forward to that. I hope to see you all again on the next stream. And please don't forget to make all the stuff I said, and take care. And we will see you then. Goodbye.